impact. Or a saying, like in my church I learned an acronym for friend, which I don't even remember anymore. I know it was for faith. I guess H was hell, I don't know. And you're supposed to go and knock on people's doors individually. And if they welcome you in, try to somehow steer the conversation to go into this acronym to lead people to Christ. Very individualistic. One of our elders in service likes to say this: one person can talk about love, and you can kind of observe it. It's not talk about God's love. You know, you're not experiencing it. You kind of get it. You don't get it, but you get it. Like, you can hear me talk about love. Two people can demonstrate love, and you can kind of observe and be like, okay, I see how Jonathan and Jason try to love each other in a Christ-like way. Okay, I see them demonstrating love. But when you add a third person, the number of relationships exponentially grows. There's just one person, there's one person and 0 relationships. When there's 2 people, there's 1 relationship. And once you add the third, we're now at 3 relationships, right? And once you do that, it provides a space within which people can enter and actually experience the love of God. I think that's quite important. You know, I think Craig talks about often, he says, I find it interesting that it was 4 friends who brought 1 paralytic to Jesus, not 1 friend bringing 4 paralytics to Jesus. There's something to be said about a community approach to evangelism. So, if you have your Bibles, turn to Acts 8. If you don't, it's okay, we'll read it out loud. Acts 8, verse 1. Whoever gets there first, want to read that? Acts 8, verse 1. So I want to look at the early church and see, did they do this? Or was it more, what was the reason for why the early church grew so quickly? How was it that thousands were coming to Christ in the early church? So Acts 8, verse 1.
On that day, a great persecution broke out against the church at Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria.
Okay. And would you read verse 4?
Therefore, those who were scattered went everywhere, preaching the word.
Okay. So those of you who have their Bibles open, because the rest of us probably missed it, because it's not the overall emphasis of these verses. Okay, so there was a persecution, it says, that arose against the church in Jerusalem. And it says that everyone was scattered outside of Jerusalem into the surrounding regions of Judea and Samaria, except whom? The apostles, the church leadership. So everyone else was scattered except the church leaders. Then verse 4 says, those who were scattered went everywhere preaching the word. I find that interesting. I thought the reason the early church grew so fast was because of these spiritual all-stars like Peter, you know, or James or John. But after recognizing this in that passage, I don't think that's the main reason why the church grew. Everyone in their community was just madly in love with Jesus. Like, I used to be a youth pastor, and or like an interim youth pastor, and I quickly learned that the challenge wasn't so much trying to teach the youth how to evangelize. It was trying to get them to the point of wanting to evangelize. Like, they already know how to evangelize. It's just, what are they evangelizing? So, for example, every time I'd watch one of the girls in the youth group get her first boyfriend, and you could be like talking about McDonald's French fries, and she'd be like, that reminds me of Brad's blonde hair. It's so cute. You know, like, they couldn't help talking about this new boyfriend they were in love with, you know? They weren't waiting to try to find a good, clever way to introduce it, you know? Same with telling people about Jesus. I think the deeper issue is, do we treasure Jesus so much that we just brag about him and all that we do? Now, I grew up in a Baptist church, and the main passage we used, that my Sunday school teachers would use, when about to talk about evangelism was 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. See if you guys recognize it. Always be ready to give a reason to everyone who asks you for the hope that is in you. You guys remember that one? Always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you. So they would quote that verse and they'd say, okay, you guys got to be ready to give a reason. So let's learn some evangelistic strategies. And we'd go into it, you know. But kind of like that day where God just gripped my heart with my hypocrisy with Crosspoint Fellowship and how I was more of a church person than I cared about Jesus. Similarly, one day I was reading that passage and God just said to me, "Hey Jason, when was the last time anyone ever asked you to give a reason for the hope they see in you?" And I thought, it's been a long time. Now, like, on my best days, I was trying to give people a reason for the hope that I had in me, but no one was taking the initiative to come to me and ask me to explain the hope that was in me. And so a second thought then popped in my mind from God, and it was this: perhaps the reason no one is asking you to give a reason for the hope that's in you is because they don't see you hoping in anything different than what they hope in. And I was cut right to the heart. In this passage, we take it out of context when we try to use it for evangelism. Because verse 14 says, even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you are blessed. Don't be afraid of their threats. Don't be troubled. Sanctify God in your hearts, and be ready to give a reason for the hope that is in you. All of 1 Peter was written to a church that was going through persecution. And they're being persecuted because they're living such a countercultural life that they stood out. And because they stood out, they were getting persecuted. And when they joyfully accepted persecution, people started to ask them, what hope do you have that causes you to rejoice in persecution? That causes you not to just be like us during this risk of being persecuted. Like you'd rather stand out and get beat up. What is causing this? And that's why I think the second thing, and probably the most important lesson we could learn today, is point 2. It's what I like to say, fascination before explanation. And this almost certainly can only happen if you move to a community approach to evangelism. Because when people come into that space that we create and experience love, they begin to get curious. It's an evangelism by fascination, an evangelism by curiosity. So St. Patrick, there would be an event before the explanation. People would become curious and fascinated, and they'd go and they'd ask questions, and then he would explain. I was very much living out 1 Peter. But how often we try to switch it and explain when people don't even have questions yet? So I'm not saying we shouldn't brag about Jesus and talk about Jesus and all we do. What I am saying is we should be forming ourselves into communities and loving and living our lives in such a way that people become curious and fascinated. I suspect you guys get some of that. Why would you choose to live in an SRO? Someone's curious by the way you're living your life differently. And they ask. Jesus, he only initiated about half of the conversations he had, if that, in the Gospels. If you were to read through them, most of the time, more than half of the time, it's people coming to him and asking questions. Because he would often have an event, either a miracle, just this crazy teaching, this kind of stunt that he just did, act that he just did, and people come with their questions. And he's explaining this fascination before explanation. So, what are some gospel examples that you guys can think of where Jesus